What happens when Hollywood's most elusive star, a man known for his cool composure and guarded privacy, is suddenly cornered on live television, pushed one question too far by a host whose words can slice like a blade? What happens when Leonardo DiCaprio, a figure often wrapped in mystery and quiet charm, finally breaks his silence and fires back? Right there, in front of millions. The tension began long before Leonardo ever stepped foot on that brightly lit stage of The View. Weeks of rumors had swirled online. Murmurs about his personal life, whispers about his environmental activism being performative, and of course, endless tabloids dissecting his dating history. Sunny Hostin, known for her sharp wit and refusal to back down from controversial topics, had reportedly told producers she was not going to let Leo skate by with easy answers. That morning, the New York skyline was bathed in a soft autumn light. Inside ABC's studio, the air hummed with anticipation. The audience lined up outside hours earlier, their chatter a mix of excitement and curiosity. Inside, the production crew buzzed around, adjusting lights, testing microphones, and occasionally glancing toward the green room where the world's biggest movie star sat, uncharacteristically quiet, his signature calm masking the storm inside. Leonardo DiCaprio was no stranger to interviews, but talk shows had always been tricky. He had a way of keeping things professional, smooth, never too personal. But today felt different. There was a hint of weariness in his eyes, as though the weight of years of speculation had finally caught up to him. His publicist whispered last-minute reassurances, but Leo barely responded, staring at the reflection of himself in the dressing room mirror. When he finally walked out onto the stage, the cheers from the live audience were thunderous. Whoopi Goldberg, the season moderator, smiled warmly and extended a hand. Joy Behar offered a quick quip about how the studio just got a little better looking, which drew laughter and eased the tension momentarily. But Sunny Hostin, sitting 2 seats away, didn't smile. She simply folded her hands on the table, her eyes following Leonardo with an almost surgical focus. The cameras went live. The iconic theme of The View faded, and the hosts launched into their usual morning banter. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. Leo talked about his new film, his passion for ocean conservation, and the Foundation's latest initiatives. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. But then, as if the atmosphere itself shifted, Sunny tilted her head slightly, and her tone grew sharper. "Leo," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you've been an outspoken advocate for climate change, urging governments and citizens to do more. But some people think your personal choices, like traveling on private jets, vacationing on yachts, send a different message. Do you think that undermines your credibility as an activist?" The studio went still. Even the air seemed to pause. For a brief moment, Leonardo just sat there, his blue eyes fixed on her, unblinking. The camera captured the subtle twitch in his jaw, the slight furrow in his brow. Joy shifted in her chair. Whoopi's expression softened into something more cautious, and the audience murmured, sensing the brewing storm. Leo cleared his throat, his voice even at first. "I've heard that criticism before," he said slowly, "and I've tried to address it. I've made personal changes over the years, reducing my travel footprint, investing in sustainable technologies. But I think it's important to remember that this fight, it's bigger than one person's travel habits. We need systemic change." Sunny didn't back down. "But don't you think you, as a role model, have a responsibility to lead by example? It's hard for people to take that message seriously when they see you living in a way they can't relate to." That was when something shifted in Leonardo's tone. The composure that had defined him for decades wavered, just enough to let the audience glimpse the frustration simmering beneath. "I get that I'm an easy target," he said, his voice dropping lower, tighter. "But sometimes I think people want a perfect hero instead of real progress. I've spent my entire adult life fighting for this planet. I've put my money, my time, my reputation on the line. If all we do is tear down the people trying to help, then what are we really doing? Are we solving the problem, or just pointing fingers?" The audience reacted, soft murmurs, a few scattered claps. Whoopi tried to step in, gently steering the conversation back to the film. But Sunny leaned forward, her eyes locked on Leonardo like a hawk circling its prey. "I think people just want honesty," she pressed. "They want to know the man behind the speeches. Because when they see someone preaching sacrifice while living in luxury, it feels hypocritical." For the first time that morning, Leo's famous composure cracked. The look in his eyes shifted. No longer the careful, measured gaze of a media-trained star, but something rawer, more human. You know what's hypocritical? He said, his voice rising, a tremor of anger breaking through. It's sitting here, tearing someone apart for doing what they can, while billion-dollar industries keep burning the planet down. You want honesty? Fine. I'm not perfect. I never claimed to be. But I'd rather be criticized for trying than be silent while everything burns. The room fell silent. You could hear a pin drop. The live audience sat frozen, eyes darting between Sunny and Leo. Joy Behar blinked, visibly caught off guard. Whoopi held up her hand as if to slow the rising tension, but her lips stayed pressed together, letting the moment breathe. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then a single clap broke the silence, tentative at first, then joined by more, until the studio was filled with a low rumble of applause, mixed with a few uncomfortable coughs and murmurs. Sunny's face remained composed, but her eyes narrowed slightly, her chin lifting as though to say she wasn't done yet. But in that instant, it was clear. Leonardo DiCaprio had fired back, and the confrontation had just begun. The audience's applause faded into an uneasy hush, like the air before a thunderclap. The camera zoomed in on Leonardo's face, those sharp, defiant eyes fixed on Sunny Hostin. For a moment, there was nothing but the faint hum of the studio lights and the almost imperceptible creak of a chair as Joy shifted uncomfortably. Sunny leaned forward just slightly, her fingers laced together on the table, a calculated calmness in her posture. She had the look of a seasoned prosecutor about to deliver a closing argument. "Leo," she began again, her tone low but resonant, "I respect your passion. I really do. But I also think it's fair to ask. Do you think your message about protecting the planet would be stronger if your personal choices didn't seem at odds with it?" The way she said it, controlled, deliberate, felt like a challenge flung across the table. Leo tilted his head, the faintest trace of a wry smile ghosting across his lips. It wasn't amusement. It was the kind of smile that flashes when someone's patience begins to fray. "I think the message is strong enough without being reduced to my private life," he replied. "I'm an actor. I've chosen to use my platform to raise awareness, to fund solutions. If we're going to solve the climate crisis by scrutinizing every plane ticket, then we're already lost." The audience chuckled lightly at that, a small ripple of support for Leo, but it was clear Sunny wasn't swayed. "It's not about every plane ticket," she said firmly. "It's about authenticity. People feel like they're being told to sacrifice while the people telling them to do so don't seem to be sacrificing themselves." Leo's hands, which had been resting loosely on the table, tightened into a subtle clasp. The camera caught the tension in his knuckles, the way his shoulders shifted back as if he were bracing himself. "Authenticity," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Do you think the fight for the Amazon rainforest stops because I took a plane to get here today? Do you think the Arctic ice waits for us to figure out who's authentic enough to speak up for it? This isn't about a person. It's about a planet." The live audience murmured again, a mixture of agreement and unease. Whoopi Goldberg, sensing the rising heat, stepped in with a steady voice. All right, we're all on the same side when it comes to wanting a better planet. Let's not turn this into a—" But Sunny interrupted her, her voice rising just enough to cut through Whoopi's attempt to defuse the moment. "No, I think it's important we talk about this, because celebrities have so much influence. When they say one thing and do another, it confuses people. It weakens the movement." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. Leo's famous calm was slipping, not into rage, but into something sharper, an edge in his voice that made every word land like a hammer striking steel. "I've spent decades fighting for these causes," he said, his voice firmer now. "Not in tweets, not in empty slogans. I've met with scientists, world leaders, indigenous communities on the front lines of deforestation. I've seen entire ecosystems wiped out while we sit in air-conditioned studios and argue about optics. If people are more interested in how I get to a conference than in the crisis we're facing, then maybe we need to ask ourselves who's really being distracted." The studio audience reacted again, this time with louder applause, punctuated by a few whistles of approval. A camera panned across faces in the crowd, some nodding along, some looking unsettled, all riveted. Sunny straightened in her seat, but there was no backing down. "I hear you," she said, her voice cool but slightly tightened at the edges. "But when you become the face of a movement, you don't get to separate the message from the messenger." Leo exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, his elbows resting lightly on the table. His voice softened just enough to draw the audience in, yet carried an unmistakable conviction. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. We keep looking for a flawless face to lead us. There isn't one. Not me. Not anyone. The planet doesn't need perfect people. It needs billions of imperfect people doing their best. That line landed. It hung in the air, heavy and poignant. Joy Behar broke the silence with a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. Well, she quipped, I guess we're all imperfect then. Except for my dog, of course. The audience chuckled, the tension easing for a brief heartbeat. But Sunny's eyes never left Leo. You've had a lot of influence, she pressed again, her tone sharpening. Do you ever think you've used it to deflect criticism rather than confront it? Leo's expression shifted, something between incredulity and exasperation. He opened his mouth to respond but stopped, as if weighing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new intensity. I don't deflect, he said. I confront the crisis. That's why I've put my name, my money, and my time behind it. I could have stayed quiet. I could have stuck to making movies and collecting awards. But I chose to step into the fire. If that makes me a target, so be it. I can handle criticism. What I can't handle is inaction. The crowd responded again, louder this time, applause that rolled through the studio like a wave. A few audience members even stood up briefly before the camera cut away. Whoopi raised her hands with a smile that tried to diffuse the energy in the room. Okay, folks, let's keep our seats. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about Leo's new movie and the message behind it. But as the camera light turned red and the show cut to commercial, the energy in the studio didn't dissipate. It intensified. Audience members leaned toward each other, whispering. On-set producers exchanged quick, nervous glances. A couple of the camera operators looked to each other as if to silently ask, did that really just happen? Meanwhile, Leo sat back in his chair, his face momentarily unreadable, as if he were staring at some distant horizon only he could see. His publicist, standing just off stage, subtly gestured to him, mouthing something that looked like, breathe. Sunny sat composed, sipping from her mug, her expression that of someone who had not retreated, but was instead preparing for the next round. When the show returned from commercial, the mood was unmistakably changed. The audience buzzed with the kind of electric anticipation usually reserved for breaking news. Whoopi smiled into the camera, her professionalism unwavering. We're back with Leonardo DiCaprio, talking about his latest film and some very passionate views on climate change. Leo nodded politely, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Sunny shifted slightly in her chair, the studio lights reflecting off her earrings as she spoke again, her voice measured yet probing. Leo, in your new film, you play a character who risks everything to fight for what he believes in. Some would say you've been doing that in real life too. But do you ever feel like your public image, fair or not, distracts from the work you're trying to do? The question was softer than before, but still carried that underlying edge. Leo leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. His voice, when he answered, was steadier, more controlled, like a man who'd walked through fire and found his footing again. I've learned that no matter what you do, someone will try to turn the conversation away from the issues that matter. That's part of being in the public eye. But I can't let that stop me, because the stakes are too high. The audience murmured their approval again, the camera catching a young woman in the front row nodding with wide eyes. Sunny didn't interrupt, and for a moment, it felt as though the conversation had found a fragile equilibrium. But everyone in the room could sense it. This wasn't over. There was still more beneath the surface, a deeper conflict waiting to ignite. And as the segment wrapped and Whoopi announced they'd be diving deeper into both the film and Leo's activism after the next break, the audience clapped enthusiastically, not just for the star on stage, but for the drama unfolding before their eyes. Backstage, a producer muttered to another, "This is going to blow up online the second we post the clip." They were right. The confrontation was already sparking debates across social media as snippets of the exchange began to leak. When the commercial break ended for the second time, the energy in the studio was palpable, humming beneath the polite applause that greeted the show's return. It wasn't just a morning talk show anymore. The audience knew they were witnessing something more, a slow-burning collision between one of Hollywood's most celebrated figures and one of television's most unflinching interviewers. Whoopi's tone was lighter as she smiled into the camera. Welcome back. We've been having a very spirited conversation with Leonardo DiCaprio about his new film, his environmental advocacy, and, well, some of the challenges that come with being in the spotlight. The camera panned to Leo, who managed a slight nod, his lips pressed into a polite but restrained smile. He rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, a posture that suggested composure, but the subtle tension in his shoulders betrayed how hard-won that composure was. Sunny Hostin's expression was calm, but her eyes gleamed with a kind of sharp resolve. She leaned in slightly, her voice steady but carrying a subtle undertone of challenge. Leo, I want to be clear. This isn't about attacking you. It's about accountability. You've been a leading voice on one of the most urgent issues of our time. But sometimes the criticism you face isn't just about your travel or your lifestyle. It's about the perception that you've avoided certain conversations, that you've kept yourself separate, almost untouchable. Some people feel they don't really know who you are, beyond the films and the speeches. Leo shifted in his seat, his blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made the studio suddenly feel smaller. Maybe that's because I've tried to keep the focus on the issues, he said evenly. Not on me. I'm not the story. Or at least I shouldn't be. Sunny's brows lifted slightly, her tone softening just enough to seem like an olive branch, though the edge remained. People look for authenticity in their advocates. They want to know the heart behind the cause. And some feel that your silence about certain aspects of your personal life, your wealth, your private choices, creates a wall between you and the people you're trying to reach. The audience murmured, intrigued by the shift in the conversation. This wasn't just about carbon footprints anymore. This was about the man behind the celebrity. Leo's gaze didn't waver. For a moment, he was silent, as if weighing the risk of opening up. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. You know, there's a reason I've kept some things private. I've seen what happens when people in the public, I bear everything. The media tears them apart, and the real message, the cause, gets lost in the noise. I didn't become an actor to be a politician. I didn't become an activist to be a saint. I'm just a person trying to do some good with the platform I've been given. There was a ripple of applause from the audience, soft, almost hesitant, but heartfelt. Sunny nodded slightly but didn't back down. And yet, Leo, sometimes silence feels like avoidance. For example, she paused, letting the moment hang just long enough to draw the audience in. You've been outspoken about corporations and governments failing to act on climate change. But some critics point out that you've been less vocal about Hollywood's own contribution. The massive carbon footprint of productions, the waste of resources on film sets. Isn't that a conversation worth having too? A low murmur rippled through the audience. The tension had returned, sharp and electric. Leo leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, a gesture that looked casual at first but carried a subtle defiance. His voice, when he responded, was firm, steady, with an undercurrent of heat. I've had those conversations, behind the scenes. With studios, with producers. I've pushed for change where I could. But if you want to talk about real accountability, let's not pretend that the entertainment industry is the biggest villain in this story. We're not the ones drilling in the Arctic. We're not the ones funding campaigns to deny the science. It's easy to pick apart the flaws of individuals or even industries we can see. It's harder to go after the ones that really hold the power. The audience broke into applause again, louder this time, with a few cheers scattered among the clapping. Sunny's lips pressed together in a small, tight smile, as though acknowledging his point while silently preparing her next move. I'm not saying you're the biggest villain, but you are one of the most visible voices. And with visibility comes responsibility. Leo's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained resolute. I accept that responsibility. I've never pretended to have all the answers. I've never claimed to be perfect. But I'd rather stand up and try, imperfect as I am, than stay silent because I'm afraid someone will find fault in the way I live. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The camera captured the silence, the way the two locked eyes across the table, the tension between them as tangible as the space itself. It was Joy Behar who finally broke the moment, her voice carrying a mix of levity and concern. Can I just say, I'm glad we're having this conversation, but I'm also thinking about the poor sound guy in the back. He's probably sweating buckets, trying to decide where to point the mic right now. The audience laughed, the tension breaking like a wave against the rocks. Even Leo cracked a small, reluctant smile. Whoopi used the moment to gently steer the conversation forward. Leo, your new movie is about a man fighting for his community against overwhelming odds. A lot of people say that art can inspire change. Do you feel like your work as an actor can be as impactful as your activism? Leo's demeanor shifted as he leaned forward, his voice carrying a thoughtful gravity. I think stories have the power to change hearts in a way statistics can't. When people see what's at stake, through a character, through a story, they can't look away. That's why I choose the roles I do. That's why I keep going back, even when the criticism gets exhausting. Sunny listened, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she asked, almost softly, "Does it ever feel lonely? Being at the center of all that attention, admiration and criticism, often at the same time." The question surprised everyone, maybe even Sunny herself. The audience quieted, leaning in. Leo's eyes flickered for the briefest second, as if the question had touched something raw. He exhaled slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight. Not defensive, not fiery, but quietly vulnerable. "Yeah," he admitted. "Sometimes it does. There's this idea that if you're in the spotlight, you're somehow insulated from everything. But it's the opposite. You feel everything. The praise, the judgment. And when you're trying to do something that matters, every mistake feels magnified. Every flaw feels like a weapon waiting to be used against you." The studio was silent, the air thick with a kind of collective empathy. Even Sunny's expression softened, her usual sharpness tempered by a fleeting glimpse of understanding. For a heartbeat, the confrontation was no longer about optics or accountability. It was about humanity. Two people on opposite sides of a conversation, both grappling with the impossible weight of expectation. Then, as if remembering the nature of live television, Joy quipped lightly, "Well, if it makes you feel any better, Leo, people yell at me on Twitter for what I wear every week. So you're not alone." The audience laughed, easing the heaviness just enough for the show to breathe again. But beneath the humor, everyone could sense it, the undercurrent of something unresolved. The clash wasn't over. It had only gone deeper, shifting from headlines and talking points to something far more personal. As the segment wrapped and the music swelled for the final commercial break, the camera caught Leo glancing briefly at Sunny, a look that was neither hostile nor conciliatory, but something in between, like two fighters recognizing the strength of the other before the next round. Off camera, in the wings of the stage, producers were already strategizing. One whispered to another, "This last segment is going to be huge. Everyone's going to be talking about this." And they were right. The final part of the conversation, the one yet to unfold, would turn an already explosive morning into a cultural flashpoint, one that would reverberate far beyond the walls of the studio. The final segment of the show began with the kind of taut anticipation usually reserved for courtroom verdicts or last-minute game-winning shots. The audience's polite applause as the cameras came back on felt thinner now, almost perfunctory. Everyone was leaning forward in their seats, waiting. Whoopi Goldberg smiled at the camera, her voice steady but carrying a hint of the tension in the air. "Welcome back. We're here with Leonardo DiCaprio, talking about his new film and his ongoing advocacy for climate action. And we've had quite the discussion this morning." She turned slightly toward Leo and Sunny, a subtle gesture acknowledging the storm still hovering between them. Leo sat poised, shoulders squared, eyes calm but watchful. He had the look of someone who had been through a battle, yet still had enough left in him for one last stand. Sunny Hostin, across the table, mirrored his composure but carried an intensity in her gaze that suggested she wasn't quite done either. Whoopi gestured lightly with her hand. "Before we wrap up, I think it's worth giving both of you a chance to address the heart of what we've been circling all morning. This isn't about winning or losing. It's about understanding. Leo, you first. If there's one thing you wish people understood about you and your advocacy, what would it be?" Leo took a moment before responding, glancing briefly at the audience as if drawing strength from the sea of expectant faces. When he spoke, his voice was quiet at first, but carried a weight that commanded the room. "I'd want them to understand that I'm not doing this for headlines. I'm not perfect. I never claimed to be. But I've seen what's happening to this planet with my own eyes. Forests disappearing, oceans rising, species vanishing. I use the tools I have, my voice, my platform, my resources, because staying silent feels like giving up. And I won't give up." The audience responded with a wave of applause that grew until it filled the studio, some even standing briefly before settling back into their seats. Leo's eyes drifted back to Sunny, and for a heartbeat, there was a flicker of something almost like weariness behind his resolve. Whoopi turned to Sunny. "Sunny, your turn." Sunny leaned forward slightly, her hands folded on the table. Her voice, when it came, was softer than before, less like a prosecutor, more like a person speaking plainly. "I think what I want people to understand is that holding people accountable isn't the same as tearing them down. I believe in this cause too. I just believe we can't afford to let our leaders, whether they're politicians or celebrities, off the hook. We have to push each other to do better, because the stakes are that high. A low murmur of approval rippled through the audience. For a brief moment, the clash that had electrified the show all morning seemed to give way to something else. An uneasy but real acknowledgement that they were both fighting for the same thing, even if they came at it from different angles. But the moment of peace didn't last. Sunny's eyes met Leo's again, her tone sharpening ever so slightly. Leo, you've said you're not perfect. And that's fair. But don't you think part of the reason people focus on your lifestyle is because you've become a symbol? Symbols have power. And with that power comes a responsibility to lead by example. Leo inhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. When he spoke again, his voice was calm but carried a steely edge. I've accepted that responsibility. I've used my platform to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for conservation. I've funded projects that have saved entire ecosystems. And yes, I still live in the real world, where I travel for work, where I sometimes fail to live up to the ideals I fight for. But I'd rather be an imperfect man trying to do good than a perfect critic sitting on the sidelines. That statement landed with the weight of a gavel striking wood. The studio fell quiet, the audience holding its collective breath. Whoopi raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching in what might have been the beginnings of a smile. Well, that's a statement. The silence in the studio was finally broken by a slow, rolling wave of applause. First a few hands, then more, until the whole room erupted. Sunny didn't flinch. She held Leo's gaze for a long moment before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging that, at least in that exchange, he had met her challenge head-on. Joy Behar clapped her hands together lightly, her voice breaking through the tension with a touch of humor. Can we all agree that saving the planet is more important than who gets to win this debate? The audience laughed, the mood easing a notch. But it was clear to everyone in the room that something rare had happened on that stage. Something that went beyond the usual TV soundbites. As the show drew to a close, Whoopi addressed the camera with her trademark mix of warmth and gravitas. This has been a powerful conversation. We don't always agree on everything here, but what we do agree on is that these conversations matter. Leonardo's new movie opens this weekend, and we thank him for being here and for sharing not just his work, but his thoughts. Leo nodded, offering a polite but genuine smile to the hosts and the audience. Thanks for having me. The cameras faded to black as the credits rolled, but inside the studio, the energy lingered like static in the air. Audience members whispered to each other as they gathered their things, their faces animated with the knowledge they'd just witnessed something unforgettable. Backstage, Leo walked briskly with his publicist, his expression thoughtful but not rattled. A producer called out, "That was incredible TV," as he passed, but Leo only gave a small, distracted nod. Sunny, meanwhile, remained at the table for a few moments after the audience began to file out. She sat quietly, her hands folded, her expression pensive, as if she were turning over in her mind not just the exchange they'd had, but the weight of the issues they'd argued about. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the internet was ablaze. Clips of the confrontation flooded social media. The hashtag #LeoFiresBack trended within an hour, joined by hashtag Sunny vs. Leo and hashtag the View Showdown. On Twitter, some users hailed Leo as a hero for standing up against what they saw as unfair scrutiny. Others praised Sunny for refusing to let him off easy. Environmental activists, journalists, and celebrities chimed in, sparking a firestorm of debate that spilled into news outlets worldwide. One viral tweet read, "Leo didn't come to play. That was the most honest I've ever seen him on TV. Respect." Another countered, "Sunny asked the questions that needed to be asked. Accountability isn't an attack, it's a necessity." By that evening, the exchange was being dissected on every major news network, with pundits debating not just the confrontation itself, but the larger question of what role celebrities should play in serious global issues. Online polls popped up on entertainment sites. Who won the exchange, Leo or Sunny? The results were nearly split down the middle, reflecting just how polarized the reaction had become. Meanwhile, think pieces began to emerge, some calling the moment a turning point for Leo, showing a more human, vulnerable side to the often enigmatic actor. Others framing it as an example of how even well-intentioned celebrities can't escape public scrutiny. The following morning, paparazzi photos of Leo walking quietly into a Manhattan hotel were plastered across tabloids with headlines like, "Leo's showdown on The View. Did he go too far? But in the comments sections of those same articles, thousands of fans argued that it was exactly the kind of fire they wanted to see from their idols. Real passion, real stakes. As for Sunny Hostin, she addressed the viral moment briefly on her own social media, writing, "We can't shy away from tough conversations. Our planet deserves our honesty and our urgency." The post garnered hundreds of thousands of likes and comments, many applauding her courage to challenge someone as influential as Leonardo DiCaprio on live TV. Back on YouTube, clips of the exchange had racked up millions of views. Reaction videos, breakdowns, and commentary flooded timelines. The drama had transcended the usual celebrity gossip, becoming part of a larger cultural conversation about leadership, hypocrisy, and the messy, imperfect realities of fighting for change. For days, the story remained front-page news. But as the media frenzy began to settle, what lingered was not just the clash itself, but the way it had humanized both of them. Leo, the seemingly untouchable star showing flashes of frustration and vulnerability. Sunny, the unflinching host willing to confront power with questions many were too polite to ask. And for millions who had tuned in or watched the viral clips afterward, it was a reminder that even in a world of polished PR and carefully managed personas, the truth of a person sometimes reveals itself in the heat of confrontation. If you were in that studio audience, whose side would you be on? Do you think Leonardo DiCaprio's response was justified, or do you believe Sunny Hostin was right to push him harder? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most explosive talk show moments of the year, make sure to subscribe to Prime Narrator for more dramatic, cinematic storytelling that takes you inside the moments everyone is talking about. Don't forget to like this video to help us reach more people, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Because if there's one thing we've learned, it's that the most unforgettable moments often happen when the cameras are rolling and the gloves come off.